In the autumn of 1866, two men calling themselves Micajah and Wiley Harpe arrived in the remote Ozark Mountains of Missouri, claiming to be Confederate veterans seeking a peaceful life away from the memories of war. They carried themselves with the quiet confidence of men who had survived terrible experiences, speaking little about their past but displaying the practical skills needed to survive on the frontier. What no one in the scattered mountain settlements could have known was that these brothers had not come to escape their violent past but to perfect it. The men who would become known as the Harpe Brothers had been born in North Carolina in the 1830s, the sons of a farmer whose strict Presbyterian upbringing had failed to instill any sense of moral restraint in his children. Even as boys, Micajah and Wiley had shown disturbing tendencies toward cruelty, torturing animals and terrorizing younger children with a methodical precision that suggested something fundamentally wrong with their basic humanity. Their father, overwhelmed by their behavior and his wife's early death, had essentially abandoned any attempt at guidance, leaving the boys to raise themselves according to whatever principles they chose to adopt. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, both brothers eagerly enlisted in Confederate irregular units known for their brutal treatment of Union civilians. These guerrilla bands operated without the restraints of military discipline or the rules of conventional warfare, giving the Harpe brothers free rein to indulge their violent impulses under the cover of patriotic service. They quickly distinguished themselves among men already known for their ruthlessness, developing reputations as soldiers who took particular pleasure in the suffering of their enemies. But even the lawless environment of guerrilla warfare eventually proved too restrictive for the brothers' appetites. By 1864, they had begun supplementing their military activities with private ventures, robbing and murdering isolated civilians regardless of their political affiliations. When their own Confederate comrades began to express disgust at their excesses, the brothers understood that they would need to find a different environment for their activities once the war ended. The defeat of the Confederacy in 1865 provided the Harpe brothers with the perfect opportunity to reinvent themselves. Like thousands of other displaced veterans, they could move to new territories where their backgrounds would not be questioned and their skills could be put to profitable use. Unlike other former soldiers seeking legitimate opportunities, however, the brothers had no intention of abandoning the violence that had become their primary source of satisfaction and income. Their first stop after leaving North Carolina was a small town in eastern Tennessee, where they spent several months studying the local population and identifying potential victims. It was here that they first experimented with the combination of hospitality and murder that would later make them infamous. Working as temporary laborers at a rural tavern, they observed how travelers evaluated potential lodging and what factors made guests feel secure enough to let down their guard completely. The brothers quickly realized that the key to successful predation lay not in random violence but in systematic planning and careful victim selection. Travelers who appeared wealthy but were unfamiliar with local conditions made ideal targets, especially if they were traveling alone and had not established connections with local residents who might notice their disappearance. The challenge was creating circumstances where such victims could be approached, evaluated, and eliminated without arousing suspicion from other potential witnesses. Their solution was elegantly simple. Rather than hunting for victims in populated areas where their activities might be observed, they would create a location where victims would come to them voluntarily, seeking the very hospitality that would ultimately destroy them. An isolated inn on a remote travel route would provide the perfect combination of access to wealthy travelers and freedom from unwanted scrutiny by law enforcement or curious neighbors. In late 1866, the brothers learned of an opportunity that seemed designed for their purposes. Heinrich Zimmermann, an elderly German immigrant, operated a small inn on a lonely stretch of road through the Missouri Ozarks. Zimmermann had grown too old to manage the physical demands of his business and was seeking to sell the property so he could join his children in California. The inn's isolation, which had made it difficult for Zimmermann to attract customers, made it perfect for the brothers' intended use. The brothers approached Zimmermann in early winter, presenting themselves as former Confederate soldiers with sufficient funds to purchase his property immediately. They claimed to be eager to begin a new life as innkeepers, serving the traveling public with the same dedication they had once shown to their military duties. Zimmermann, desperate to complete the sale before winter made travel to California impossible, accepted their offer without investigating their backgrounds or questioning the source of their ready cash. What Zimmerman did not realize was that he had just agreed to become the Harpe brothers' first victim in their new enterprise. The brothers had no intention of paying for the inn through legitimate means when murder would accomplish the same result while providing them with additional funds from Zimmerman's personal possessions. On the night they were scheduled to complete the transaction, the brothers shared a bottle of whiskey with Zimmerman to celebrate their agreement, but only the old German actually consumed the doctored alcohol that would be his final drink. Heinrich Zimmerman's death established the pattern that the Harpe brothers would follow for the next year. The murder itself was methodical and efficient, accomplished through drugs that left the victim conscious but helpless while the brothers extracted information about hidden valuables and the location of important documents. Zimmerman's body was buried in what would become the first grave in the inn cellar, while his personal papers were used to create forged documents establishing the brothers' legitimate ownership of the property. The inn that became the Harpe brothers' base of operations was ideally suited for their purposes. The two-story log and stone structure sat on a hillside overlooking the only road through that section of the Ozarks, allowing the brothers to observe approaching travelers long before they reached the building. The main floor contained a common room with a large fireplace, a kitchen area, and a bar where the brothers could serve the drinks that would doom their guests. The second floor provided 4 small guest rooms where victims could be isolated and controlled, while the cellar offered secure storage for both bodies and stolen goods. The brothers spent the winter of 1866 and 1867 preparing for their new career as innkeeper murderers. They studied the chemistry of various poisons and drugs, experimenting with different substances to find combinations that would incapacitate victims reliably without causing immediate death. They also developed protocols for evaluating potential guests, learning to assess each traveler's wealth, connections, and vulnerability within minutes of their arrival. By spring of 1867, the Harpe brothers were ready to begin serving more than food and drink to the travelers who sought shelter at their remote inn. Their first paying customer was a livestock trader named Marcus Flynn who arrived on a rainy April evening with a wagon full of goods bound for Arkansas settlements. Flynn appeared to be exactly the type of victim the brothers had been preparing to exploit, well-funded, traveling alone, unfamiliar with the local area, and carrying valuable merchandise that could be easily converted to cash. The brothers greeted Flynn with the warm hospitality that would become their trademark, helping him stable his horses and offering him a hot meal and a dry place to sleep. As Flynn relaxed by the fireplace, grateful for the unexpected comfort after days of difficult travel, Micajah Harpe prepared a special drink that he claimed was a local specialty guaranteed to ward off the chill and fatigue of frontier travel. The drink was indeed special, containing a carefully measured dose of plant-based toxins that would paralyze Flynn's muscles while leaving his mind clear enough to answer questions about the location of his money and the contents of his wagon. Flynn's murder took several hours to complete, as the brothers had refined their technique to extract maximum information before allowing their victim to die. They learned not only where Flynn kept his traveling funds but also details about his family, his business connections, and his planned route through Arkansas. This information allowed them to forge letters explaining Flynn's delayed arrival and change of plans, buying additional time before anyone would begin searching for the missing trader. The disposal of Flynn's body established another element of the brothers' systematic approach to murder. Rather than risk outdoor burial that might be discovered by hunters or other travelers, they dug graves directly into the cellar floor, using lime to accelerate decomposition and control odors that might alert future guests. Flynn's wagon and horses were hidden in a concealed ravine several miles from the inn, while his trade goods were carefully catalogued and stored for eventual sale in distant markets where they would not be recognized. The success of their first murder convinced the brothers that they had found the perfect criminal enterprise. Unlike highway robbery or other forms of violent crime that required them to seek out victims and risk confrontation with armed travelers, their operation brought victims to them voluntarily while providing a legitimate cover for their presence in the area. Local residents viewed them as respectable businessmen providing valuable services to the traveling public, making it unlikely that they would become suspects if travelers began disappearing from the region. Over the following months, the Harpe brothers refined their operation with each new victim. They learned to vary their methods slightly to avoid creating obvious patterns, sometimes using different drugs or disposal techniques depending on the specific circumstances of each murder. They also developed an extensive network of contacts in various towns and settlements, allowing them to sell stolen goods and obtain information about potential victims traveling through their territory. The second victim was Samuel Morrison, the cattle buyer from Kansas City who disappeared in September 1867 while traveling to Arkansas to purchase livestock. Morrison had been recommended to seek lodging at the Harpe Brothers Inn by a livestock dealer who knew the brothers only as helpful innkeepers serving an isolated stretch of road. Morrison arrived confident in his safety, carrying significant cash for his cattle purchases and looking forward to a comfortable night's rest before continuing his journey. The brothers treated Morrison to their most elaborate hospitality, preparing a feast that included fresh game and vegetables from their garden along with generous portions of their special whiskey. As Morrison relaxed after his meal, grateful for such unexpected luxury in the wilderness, he began to feel the effects of the carefully measured drugs that Micajah Harpe had added to his drink. The paralysis began in his extremities and spread gradually throughout his body, leaving him helpless but fully aware of his situation as the brothers began questioning him about his finances and travel plans. Morrison's death was particularly profitable for the brothers, as he carried more cash than any of their previous victims and possessed detailed knowledge of cattle markets throughout the region. The information they extracted from Morrison allowed them to forge letters to his business associates explaining delays in his purchase schedule, while his money funded improvements to their inn and the purchase of additional equipment for their murder operation. The third victim was Reverend Joshua Matthews, the Methodist circuit preacher who had written enthusiastically to his wife about the Christian hospitality offered by the brothers. Matthews arrived at the inn in October 1867, carrying collection money for new churches and a detailed journal of his ministerial activities that would have made fascinating reading for anyone interested in frontier religious practices. The brothers showed particular interest in Matthews' accounts of wealthy parishioners and church fundraising activities, seeing potential for future expansion of their criminal enterprise into more populated areas. Matthews' murder followed the established pattern, but the brothers took extra time to study his journal and correspondence, learning about religious circuits throughout the Missouri and Arkansas territories. They also kept Matthews' Bible and clerical vestments, apparently planning to use them as props for future confidence schemes involving religious communities that might be more trusting of apparently pious travelers. The fourth victim was Thomas McKinnon, the fur trader whose wagon full of premium beaver pelts represented the largest single haul in the brothers' criminal career. McKinnon had survived 15 years of dangerous frontier trading and was not easily fooled, but even his suspicions were not enough to save him from the brothers' carefully planned hospitality. The brothers spent extra effort on McKinnon, recognizing that his experience and wariness required more sophisticated techniques than they had used on previous victims. McKinnon's murder provided the brothers with enough funds to consider expanding their operation, and they began making inquiries about similar properties along other isolated travel routes. The brothers had begun to view themselves as pioneering entrepreneurs in what they considered an underexploited field of criminal activity, believing that systematic hospitality-based murder could be developed into a profitable enterprise spanning multiple locations throughout the frontier territories. The fifth victim, Dr. Margaret Whitmore, represented both the brothers' most ambitious murder and the beginning of their downfall. Dr. Whitmore was traveling to treat victims of a mining accident in Arkansas, carrying medical supplies and surgical instruments that were extremely valuable on the frontier. She also carried gold coins as payment for her services and wore family jewelry that the brothers coveted for its both monetary and sentimental value. Dr. Whitmore's murder was complicated by her medical knowledge, which allowed her to recognize the symptoms of drug poisoning before the brothers' concoctions could fully take effect. She fought back with desperate courage, managing to wound Wiley Harpe with her surgical knife before the drugs finally overwhelmed her system. The brothers' usual calm efficiency was disrupted by the unexpected resistance, and they made several mistakes in disposing of evidence that would later prove crucial to their eventual capture. The sixth and most significant victim was Captain William Harper of the Missouri State Militia, whose disappearance finally triggered the systematic investigation that would expose the brothers' crimes. Harper was traveling in civilian clothes to investigate reports of continued Confederate guerrilla activity in the region, carrying coded messages and detailed intelligence reports that made his disappearance a matter of immediate military concern. Unlike previous victims, Harpe was expected to report regularly to his military superiors, making it impossible for the brothers to use their usual tactics of forging explanatory letters and covering up the disappearance. When Harpe failed to send his scheduled coded message, military investigators began retracing his route with the thoroughness and resources that civilian authorities had lacked. The military investigation revealed the pattern that civilian authorities had missed: multiple travelers disappearing along the same isolated road, all carrying money or valuable goods, all last seen in the vicinity of an inn operated by two brothers claiming to be former Confederate soldiers. The investigators also noted inconsistencies in the brothers' accents and backgrounds that suggested they were not entirely comfortable with the identities they had assumed. The breakthrough came when investigators located James Crawford, the whiskey smuggler who had survived his encounter with the Harpe brothers by pretending to drink their drugged alcohol while actually pouring most of it into his boots. Crawford's testimony provided the first eyewitness account of the brothers' methods and gave investigators the probable cause needed to obtain a search warrant for the inn and surrounding property. The search of the Harpe brothers' inn on December 3, 1867, revealed the full scope of their crimes. The cellar contained the remains of 11 victims in various states of decomposition, systematically buried in lime-covered graves dug directly into the floor. Personal effects belonging to the known missing travelers were found carefully organized in wooden crates, along with goods stolen from victims whose disappearances had not yet been reported to authorities. But the most chilling discovery was the detailed ledger hidden behind a loose stone in the cellar wall. Written in Micajah Harpe's careful handwriting, the ledger contained entries for each victim, recording their names, arrival dates, estimated value of possessions, and notes about the effectiveness of different drug dosages. The entries were written in a business-like tone that treated murder as a commercial transaction, with observations about which victims had been easier to subdue and which had required additional measures. The ledger revealed that the brothers had been operating their deadly inn for almost exactly 1 year, beginning with Heinrich Zimmermann's murder in January 1867. The records showed a systematic progression in their techniques, with each murder building on lessons learned from previous crimes. The brothers had not been random killers driven by immediate greed but methodical predators who viewed mass murder as a sustainable business model requiring constant refinement and improvement. More disturbing than the clinical murder records were the brothers' future plans, outlined in the ledger's final pages. They had been actively planning to expand their operation by recruiting accomplices and acquiring additional inns along other isolated travel routes throughout Missouri and Arkansas. The ledger contained detailed maps of potential locations with notes about traffic patterns and law enforcement presence, suggesting that the brothers viewed their crimes as the foundation for a criminal empire that could operate across multiple territories. The arrest of Micajah and Wiley Harpe occurred without resistance on December 3, 1867, shortly after the search of their property began. Both brothers were found calmly eating breakfast in the inn's kitchen, apparently unconcerned by the presence of armed soldiers surrounding their building. When informed that they were under arrest for multiple counts of murder, Micajah Harpe reportedly smiled and asked whether the charges included Heinrich Zimmermann because they wanted to ensure all their business transactions were properly documented for legal purposes. The brothers' calm demeanor during their arrest disturbed even experienced lawmen who had dealt with violent criminals throughout their careers. The Harpe brothers showed no remorse, fear, or surprise at being caught, instead seeming almost pleased that their careful record-keeping was finally being appreciated by people who could understand the scope of their accomplishments. When asked why they had maintained such detailed records of their crimes, Wiley Harpe explained that they had always planned to write a book about their experiences once they accumulated enough wealth to retire from active killing. The trial of the Harpe brothers began on February 15, 1868, in Springfield, Missouri, before Judge Harrison Mills, a former Union Army prosecutor experienced in handling war crimes cases. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity with spectators from across the region who had come to witness what newspapers were calling the most horrific criminal case in Missouri Territory history. Many attendees were family members of missing persons hoping to learn the fate of their loved ones, while others came simply to see the faces of men capable of such calculated evil. Territorial prosecutor David Mackenzie presented the case methodically, using the brothers' own ledger as his primary evidence. The clinical entries were read aloud to a horrified courtroom, each victim's story told through the killer's own words. When Mackenzie read Micajah Harpe's notes about perfecting drug dosages to keep victims conscious while extracting information about hidden valuables, several spectators had to be escorted outside to recover their composure. James Crawford's testimony proved to be the most dramatic moment of the proceedings. The whiskey smuggler described his narrow escape in vivid detail, explaining how he had pretended to be drugged while listening to the brothers plan his murder and discuss previous victims with casual indifference. Crawford's account of crawling across the floor while paralyzed, knowing that discovery meant certain death, reduced many listeners to tears and provided the jury with a first-hand account of the brothers' methods. The defense strategy was unprecedented in its audacity. Rather than claiming innocence, the brothers' court-appointed attorney argued that they were victims of psychological trauma suffered during Confederate military service. Defense counsel Marcus Whitfield suggested that the brothers had become so accustomed to killing during the war that they were unable to distinguish between military action and civilian murder in peacetime. This argument collapsed when the prosecution demonstrated that the brothers had made no effort to determine their victims' political affiliations and had murdered Confederate veterans, neutral civilians, and religious figures who had served both armies during the conflict. The systematic nature of their crimes and their detailed planning for expansion clearly indicated that they were motivated by profit rather than confused loyalty to a defeated cause. The most chilling aspect of the trial was the brothers' own testimony. Both defendants insisted on taking the witness stand despite their attorney's horror at the decision. Micajah Harpe testified for 3 hours, describing their methods with the same clinical detachment evident in his written records. He explained how they had refined their techniques for drugging guests, experimenting with different substances to achieve optimal results, and detailed their system for evaluating potential victims based on clothing, horses, and apparent wealth. Wiley Harpe focused on what he called the practical aspects of their operation, describing the challenges of disposing of bodies and maintaining the inn to eliminate evidence that might alert future guests. Both brothers expressed pride in what they considered the sophistication of their methods, speaking about their murders as professional accomplishments and noting improvements in their techniques over time. The prosecution presented testimony from victims' families, each account adding tragedy to the overwhelming evidence. Samuel Morrison's business partner described the economic impact of Morrison's disappearance on cattle ranchers unable to sell their livestock, while Reverend Matthew's widow testified about frontier congregations left without spiritual guidance. Dr. Whitmore's medical colleagues described patients who died waiting for treatment that never arrived because their physician had been murdered for her medical supplies. The most heartbreaking testimony came from Heinrich Zimmerman's daughter Anna, who had traveled from St. Louis after learning of her father's murder. She testified that Zimmerman had written excitedly about selling the inn and joining his family in California, where his son had established a successful farm. The family had waited months for Zimmerman's arrival, growing increasingly worried as winter approached without word from their patriarch. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 11 counts of first-degree murder. The speed of their decision reflected not only the overwhelming evidence but also the community's shock at the calculated nature of the crimes. Judge Mills sentenced both brothers to death by hanging, scheduling their executions for April 10, 1868, and describing them as individuals so devoid of human sympathy that they represented a threat to civilized society that could only be eliminated through the ultimate penalty. The brothers received their death sentences with the same emotional detachment they had shown throughout the trial. Micajah Harpe asked whether they would be permitted to continue their ledger entries while awaiting execution, explaining that he wanted to document their experiences with the legal system for future researchers who might study their case. Wiley Harpe requested permission to write letters to relatives in other states, though he refused to reveal their identities, claiming he did not want his family embarrassed by association with their crimes. The execution of the Harpe brothers was carried out as scheduled on April 10, 1868, before a crowd of nearly 3,000 spectators in Springfield's town square. Both men maintained their composure throughout the proceedings, showing no fear or remorse as they were led to the gallows. In their final statements, each brother thanked authorities for what they called a fair trial and proper recognition of their professional accomplishments. Micajah Harpe used his last words to recommend that law enforcement agencies study their methods as examples of effective criminal organization, while Wiley Harpe expressed hope that their techniques might prove useful for military applications in future conflicts. Even facing death, the brothers remained convinced that their systematic approach to murder represented a significant contribution to criminal methodology that deserved scholarly recognition. The aftermath of the Harpe Brothers case extended far beyond the immediate impact on victims' families and the local community. The territorial government implemented new requirements for licensing and inspecting inns and taverns in isolated areas, while military authorities increased patrols along remote travel routes to deter similar criminal enterprises. The case influenced development of communication networks between settlements as communities recognized the need for better systems to track missing persons and coordinate investigations across territorial boundaries. The psychological impact on law enforcement personnel was significant and lasting. Several members of the search party that discovered the cellar graves resigned from their positions, unable to continue their duties after witnessing such systematic brutality. Territorial Marshal Robert Hayes, who led the investigation, later wrote that the case had taught him that some forms of evil were beyond normal human comprehension and required law enforcement to develop new methods for dealing with criminals who operated without conscience or motivation beyond financial gain. The Harpe Brothers' inn was burned to the ground 3 days after their execution, with many community members participating in what became an unofficial ceremony of purification. The site remained empty for more than 20 years, as local residents considered the location cursed and avoided the area whenever possible. Travelers on the old road reported feeling inexplicable dread when passing the location, even after all physical traces of the building had been eliminated by weather and vegetation growth. Modern criminologists who have studied the Harpe Brothers case note similarities between their methods and those employed by serial killers in later eras, suggesting that their systematic approach to murder was far ahead of its time in terms of criminal sophistication. The detailed records they maintained provided law enforcement with insights into criminal planning and execution that would not become common until the development of modern investigative techniques more than a century later. The case influenced frontier literature and folklore, with the brothers becoming legendary figures representing dangers that lurked in isolated areas during America's westward expansion. Stories about the brothers were told around campfires and in frontier taverns for generations, often embellished with supernatural elements reflecting the profound impact their crimes had on popular imagination. Some versions claimed the brothers had made pacts with demonic forces, while others suggested they were supernatural entities rather than human beings who had chosen to become predators. The lasting legacy of the Harpe Brothers case was its demonstration that frontier America had produced criminals whose sophistication and brutality matched anything seen in later, more urbanized eras. The brothers had operated with planning and organization that challenged assumptions about frontier crime being primarily impulsive and opportunistic. Their systematic approach to murder, careful record-keeping, and long-term planning for expansion revealed criminal minds capable of treating mass murder as a sustainable business enterprise rather than isolated violent acts driven by immediate need or passion. The case also provided early insights into the psychology of serial killers, showing how individuals completely lacking in empathy could function effectively in society while systematically destroying human lives for personal gain. The brothers' ability to present themselves as respectable businessmen while operating one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in American history demonstrated the dangers posed by predators who could manipulate social expectations and community trust to access victims. For families of the victims, the Harpe Brothers case represented not just personal tragedy but a fundamental violation of the frontier values of hospitality and mutual assistance that made survival possible in isolated communities. The brothers had perverted the essential trust between travelers and innkeepers that allowed commerce and communication to function across vast distances, creating lasting suspicion that affected frontier hospitality for generations. The case remains significant in American criminal history as an early example of organized serial killing that combined careful planning, systematic execution, and detailed record-keeping with a complete absence of human conscience or remorse. The Harpe Brothers demonstrated that the capacity for sophisticated evil was not limited to modern urban environments but could flourish in any setting where predators could find vulnerable victims and favorable conditions for their operations. Today, more than 150 years after their crimes, the Harpe Brothers continue to fascinate students of criminal psychology and frontier history. Their case provides a window into both the dangers of America's westward expansion and the eternal human capacity for evil that transcends time, place, and circumstance. The detailed records they left behind offer unique insights into the minds of killers who viewed murder as a profession requiring constant study and improvement, making their crimes both more comprehensible and more terrifying to modern understanding. The victims of the Harpe brothers deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case but as individuals whose lives were cut short by calculated evil. Heinrich Zimmermann, the elderly German immigrant seeking to join his family in California. Samuel Morrison, the cattle buyer working to connect frontier ranchers with eastern markets. Reverend Joshua Matthews, the Methodist preacher ministering to scattered congregations. Thomas McKinnon, the fur trader who had survived 15 years of dangerous frontier life only to meet death in what should have been a safe haven. Dr. Margaret Whitmore, the physician traveling to save lives who lost her own to men who valued human existence only as a source of profit. Captain William Harper, the military officer whose investigation of Confederate guerrilla activity led him to an encounter with predators far more dangerous than any he had been assigned to track. These victims, and the others whose names may never be known, represent the human cost of evil that operates without restraint or conscience. Their deaths served as a wake-up call to frontier communities about the need for vigilance and systematic law enforcement even in the most remote areas. The Harpe brothers' case stands as a permanent reminder that civilization requires constant effort to maintain and that the capacity for evil exists in every time and place where humans interact with one another. The story of the Harpe brothers and their victims continues to resonate because it illustrates fundamental truths about human nature that remain relevant regardless of historical period or social context. It shows how predators can exploit the trust and hospitality essential for social functioning, how systematic evil can masquerade as respectability, and how individual acts of courage like James Crawford's survival and testimony can expose crimes that might otherwise continue indefinitely. If you found this exploration of one of America's most chilling historical crimes compelling, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more deep investigations into forgotten cases that shaped our understanding of criminal behavior. Like this video if you appreciate detailed historical analysis, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how this case compares to modern criminal investigations, and share this content with anyone interested in true crime history. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you'll be alerted when we release new episodes examining the dark corners of America's past where evil flourished in the shadows of our expanding frontier.